What are internal service funds? They are focused to providing services to other departments. So for instance, when you do the exercise, the CAFR exercise, some of you might get lucky and pick a state which has no internal service funds. Literally none. New York State has none. And you go, I'm sorry. Yes, you're very disappointed. He's very disappointed. Okay. But do a little search. Make sure that it's not hidden somewhere else, because it's a non-major fund, but you will find that. So for instance, San Francisco has like 4 different internal service funds. Now, let me just describe to you what that is. When governments do things which are repetitive and cost money, for instance, printing, motor pool, insurance, they have a choice, right? They can go out and do that outside, or they can do it internally. But many governments think that if they do it internally and they have sufficient volume, they can do it more cheaply. So when that happens, they have to decide what they should do next. Should we finance this activity through the general fund, or should we set up a separate internal service fund? Many choose to do it through a separate internal service fund. Why? Because by going through the internal service fund, they can track the amount they spend on doing that activity and then charge back to those people who use it. So that's the rationale behind internal service fund. The other rationale is a little more hidden. And this is, maybe you won't appreciate it now, but governments don't like to show surpluses, because what happens when they show surpluses? People are paying too many taxes, right? How do you hide surplus? You spend or do something else. Transfer it to another fund, like the internal service fund, which doesn't show up the way the governmental funds show up. Now, I'm not saying governments do that, but some governments might be tempted to do that. Okay. What are some of the examples? These are some of the examples. Motor pools, purchasing, storage, supplies, insurance pools, central data processing. The example that's given to you in the book is a self-insurance pool. They talk a little bit about that. And it's, I belong to the audit board of something called the Joint Insurance Fund, which is comprised of almost all the municipalities in New Jersey. Basically what they do is, rather than go buy insurance themselves, they all pool and set up a joint insurance fund, which then goes out and buys insurance in bulk. And they save money doing it that way. Governments tend to do the same thing with insurance. By having a pool, they are able to save money, and they run that through the internal service fund. I won't go into the pricing policy. The whole thing is how do you set pricing, and there's discussion in the book about what the pricing policy should be. You can read about this. We have more important things here. A couple of accounts that we use when we use the internal service funds. Notice the account is not called revenue, it's called billings to departments. Notice the account name. It's not called net income, it's called what? Excess of net billings to department over costs. Notice those two account names, different from what we might think. Billings to department, which is our revenue account, and that's excess of net billings to department over cost. So these are some of the account titles you should be familiar with. Yeah.
Could you just do me a favor? Each time you skip over something,
yeah.
mention if that's going to be on the exam or not?
I wish I could remember what's going to be. I haven't even made up the exam yet for next month. But what I'm trying to do is, if I skip over it, that means it's not that important. No, don't delete it. Don't delete it. No, but it's a good question. I'm glad you asked that question. Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I should be more specific. Yeah, yeah. So there are three statements that are prepared. There's a statement of net position. We looked at statement of revenue, expenses, and changes in fund net position, and statement of cash flows. You can look at these illustrations. The important thing, though, is what you see here. And this is the most confusing aspect of internal service funds. Now, just follow me. Enterprise funds are shown under business type activities. So we can see that. Internal service fund, there is no column for internal service funds in the government-wide statement. There is none. You don't put it in business type activities, there is none. So what happens? Now just follow this. If one arm of the government is selling to another arm of the government, what would happen if you combine both of those together? So if the $1,000 worth of printing services was provided by an internal service fund to the general fund, what would happen? General fund would show an expense of what? Expenditure of $1,000, and internal service fund would show what? A revenue of $1,000, right? What would happen if you combine them both together? No. Your revenues would, because you have to add all your revenues, you don't net it. Your revenues would be added, that $1,000, to the governmental fund, and your expenditures will correspondingly go up by 1,000, so the net would be zero. But your gross would be what? Higher, because you're combining these two together. And in order to avoid this double counting, what they have done is, GASB has said that any transaction which takes place within the government, you need to eliminate it. So basically, in the government-wide statement, if the general fund spends $1,000 and the internal service fund receives a revenue of 1,000, you need to eliminate those two activities. Now, can you do that with every single item in the internal service fund? No, not things like fixed assets, because they're part of it. And this is what this means, okay? Second point, in the government-wide financial statements, internal service funds are reported as part of the governmental activities column. They must be eliminated, any activity between the two. I want you to think about this. Again, it's no different than transaction happening within the government itself. Can't have that. In the government-wide, because what is the government-wide statement? Covers the entire government. Okay? And that's the reason why that's an important point. Okay? And as you can see, internal service funds are never considered major funds, neither are they required to be used by GASB. GASB does not require the use of internal service fund. You'll see it might require the use of enterprise fund, but never internal service funds. This is something about the internal service fund and risk management insurance pools. It talks about when they should recognize the claim as an expense if it's probable that an asset has been impaired or liability. It's no different than what we have learned with other types of liabilities. Question is, when do you recognize an expense and a related liability? When you know that the asset has been impaired. It's like an insurance claim. Dissolving a fund, you can read that on your own, not as important. Okay, enterprise funds. This is really what this whole topic